Scottsboro, an American tragedy movie review. So this is a documentary, and it is an absolutely fascinating documentary. I fully recommend you check it out. In fact, I recommend that you don't waste your time listening to me ramble on about this documentary. If you haven't seen it yet, just turn off this video of me talking and go and find a video of Scottsboro, an American tragedy, and watch that instead. Trust me, it's absolutely fascinating. You won't regret it. Now, where to find it? As of this recording in August 2020, there is a copy on YouTube. I will link to the description down below. I will put the link in the description down below. Click on that link and it'll take you to the YouTube video. Unfortunately, I don't think that video is up there legally, meaning I don't think it's up there with the permission of the copyright holders, which means it's probably only temporary. It'll get taken down in a couple of months or so. So if you're watching this video at some time in the future, and that link is not working, then I don't know, search YouTube. Maybe it's up somewhere else, or try and find it somewhere else on the internet, wherever videos are hosted. Or, go to Amazon and try and actually order a copy of the DVD or something. Or I don't know, maybe it's on Netflix somewhere or something. However you can get a hold of this documentary, I recommend it. So, just to reiterate, I don't recommend you listen to me. I recommend you turn this review off and find the actual documentary itself. That being said, for the rest of this video, I'm just going to ramble on and do my usual rambling, incoherent review in which I give some of my thoughts. And I guess I might as well start all the way at the beginning by talking about who or what are the Scottsboro Boys. So the Scottsboro Boys is one of those forgotten episodes of American history. It was, and the documentary illustrates this very well. It was such a big deal at the time, and then it's been completely forgotten ever since then. I never heard about it at all in my high school history class, and I suspect most of you other Americans, did not hear about this in your high school history classes as well. Although, by all means, let me know in the comments down below what your experiences were. I'd be curious. When did you hear of when did you first hear of the Scottsboro Boys? How did you first hear of the Scottsboro Boys? I first heard about them in university, and the only reason I heard about them in university was because I was taking a class on African American history. I was a history major at university. So if you take a specialized class like African American history, then it probably will come up. Although even in that class, it came up very briefly. As I remember, this was back in the 1990s. As I remember, it was only one paragraph of the textbook, and it just gave very bare bones details. And those very bare bones details were, there was a case in the South where two women accused 9 black men. Actually, I shouldn't say men because they were all teenagers. So boys, really, 9 teenage boys. 2 white women accused 9 black teenage boys of raping them. After a very short trial, because this was in the South, all 9 of those boys were sentenced to death. And they probably would have been executed, except the Communist Party heard about this case. And the Communist Party made this into an international incident. All kinds of publicity was focused on the Scottsboro Boys. As a result, they got retried in several appeals. And long story short, their sentences were eventually either commuted to prison or some of them were set free. And that's basically the story, and that was basically all that was in the textbook. Now, perhaps that story sounds a little bit strange to you if you're an American, because you're probably thinking, the Communist Party? What? How does the Communist Party have any influence in America? Well, this incident occurred in the 1930s. And the 1930s was a brief window in American history where the Communist Party did have a fair degree of influence in American history. It wasn't until the 1950s and the Red Scare and the Cold War and all that, that being a communist in America became absolutely forbidden, and you were evil if you were a communist. That's all from the 1950s. In the 1930s, the Communist Party, they weren't exactly mainstream, but they weren't exactly powerful officially in the US government, but they did have a fair amount of influence. They had an influence particularly among intellectuals and artist types and workers. Kind of those three groups were attracted to the Communist Party in America. And although they never had any official power, they had a great degree of organization, kind of boots on the ground type thing. So, when the Communist Party in the 1930s decided to make an incident out of this, a national and then an international incident, they actually did have some degree of influence or some degree of muscle that they could flex to get attention in on this case and to organize and agitate and get people worked up about this case, which they did. So yeah, that was basically all I learned about it, even in an African American history class. Now that was back in the 90s. This documentary came out in 2001. So it came out the year after I graduated from college, and I do remember reading about it briefly in the paper, reading reviews of it. Excuse me. It did get a theatrical release in 2001, and it was also funded by PBS and is part of the PBS series, The American Experience, which is a television series on PBS. PBS, for you non-Americans, is the American Public Broadcasting Television Channel. I am a little bit confused about the exact relationship, and I did try and research this before filming this video, looking up on Wikipedia and stuff like that, and I'm still a little bit confused. This is either a documentary that was made for theaters, but then also got funding for by the American Experience, or it's an episode of the American Experience that maybe somebody later decided was good enough for a theatrical release. I don't know. The American Experience is a series of documentaries made for the PBS channel, which airs on PBS, and it is generally quite good. I mean, this one is especially quite good, but really any of the episodes of the American Experience, if you have an opportunity to track them down, are worth watching. This one in particular, actually, even though I do remember when this came out in 2001, I found this DVD in the university library where I was studying at 10 years later when I was doing my graduate degree. And it was in the university library with a whole bunch of other episodes of American Experience. So it wasn't even categorized as a movie. But because it did get a theatrical release at one time, I'm reviewing this here under my movie review project. Okay, so I'm going to repeat myself here. This documentary is absolutely fascinating, and I've given a brief overview of what the Scottsboro Boys case actually was, and that was reflective about what I had learned in school. But it turns out, once you get into this documentary, that there is so much more courtroom drama than that brief synopsis that my university textbook gave about the Scottsboro Boys. I mean, you've got the appeals, you've got these stories about cross-examinations and witnesses being destroyed on the stand, and one, a surprise witness being called at the last minute, and a witness for the prosecution who suddenly becomes a witness for the defense, and kind of all the, I mean, if it wasn't real, if it wasn't a real thing, you'd almost think this was a cliche. You'd almost think, I mean, if somebody had made this up as a fictional drama, you'd be like, oh, not that cliche again. Not the cliche of the last minute witness being called out of nowhere. But it's all there, it's all true, and it's all in this documentary. It's just all the courtroom drama that would make this into like a great dramatic episode is there. I realize to a certain extent by saying that I'm somewhat trivializing the incident, because this was also a huge incident of racial injustice that happened. So I don't want to trivialize it too much, but it is really fascinating to watch this whole story played out. And apparently, I mentioned that this was a forgotten episode of American history, and I think before these filmmakers, these documentarians, dug this up, it really was quite forgotten. Apparently, they did the work of digging through the archives and finding this material that had just been largely forgotten since the 1930s, because people had just forgotten about this case. So they did a great job of kind of going through the archives and reconstructing this story that very few people actually remembered or cared about at the time. And then since then, well, I mean, unfortunately, it's still kind of forgotten. I mean, it had this brief moment maybe in 2001 when this documentary came out and people were talking about it briefly. But it's, not as remembered as it should be. So, by all means, go seek this documentary out and start talking about it again. It's funny, that YouTube video I alluded to, the one that I'll link in the description down below, that's probably not up there legally. People are writing in the comments like, wow, this is just like nowadays. And I think talking about some of the same racial issues and maybe some of the same scenes of protest that have been in the news so recently here in 2020 seem to have were issues that they were dealing back with in the 1930s as well. So arguably very relevant to today and worth checking out. It's fascinating. You get a sense watching the documentary how big a deal this was. And they talk about how this was an international and national incident and in all the papers and a media circus and kind of all the things that go along with that. And then, completely forgotten about today. And it's just a reminder that just because something is a huge deal at the time does not mean it'll make it into the history textbooks. I think we forget this a lot. We tend to think that our high school history textbook was everything important that happened in American history. But it's not. They select events that fit a certain narrative. And for whatever reason, the Scottsboro Boys didn't fit that narrative. I think, well, it's somewhat of a depressing story for one thing. And I think it also doesn't fit the narrative because it happened before the civil rights movement proper kicked off. So I guess maybe history textbook writers don't know what to do with it. And maybe the fact that the Communist Party was so involved with it also makes it a little bit awkward for American history. But for whatever reason, I don't know exactly the reason, those are just guesses. For whatever reason, it doesn't fit the narrative, and so it's left out of the history textbooks. And I bet you there are just thousands of incidents like that, even in America's short 200-year history. And, it makes you think, there are so many things that are happening nowadays, or have happened in the past 10 years, say, that seem like a huge deal at the time. And 100 years from now, high school kids will have no idea what they are. Won't even be in the history textbooks. And which particular events will make it into the history textbooks and which ones won't, your guess is as good as mine. But I think it's fair to say, I think you're definitely safe in saying, that a lot of what is actually huge news now will just be completely forgotten about because it won't fit in to whatever narrative of the American story that the history textbook writers want to tell. So yeah, there's that. What else did I want to say about this documentary? Oh right, the communists. Actually, having brought up the communists, let me jump back a minute. And I think another reason that maybe people don't like to talk about this is because it's an ugly incident in American history. It's got a happy ending of sorts in that none of them were actually executed. So the 9 boys all got off in the end. Some of them had their sentences commuted. Well, I mean, sorry, they all had their sentences commuted. Some of them were let go. Some of them stayed in jail and were eventually paroled. And I think the last one actually escaped from jail. But they all got out of jail in the end. But, so, in that sense, it's kind of a story with a happy ending. You know, they were gonna execute these 9 innocent boys, and then they all got off. But as the documentary makes very clear, this is not a happy story. These were 9 boys who were just going about their lives and all of a sudden had their lives completely ruined. And the documentary makes this very clear that they were completely scarred for the rest of their lives by this horrific experience of being falsely accused of rape and being beaten by the prison guards and spending years being abused and tortured in these southern jails. They were all a mess when they got out of prison, and they all had almost all of them. I think there was one exception, but that one exception aside, the rest of them had very short and unhappy lives in which they were clearly dealing with the demons that they picked up from those years of being tortured in those southern prisons. So in spite of the fact that they got off in the end, it's not a happy story. Yeah. Okay. So that being said, I want to talk briefly about the Communist Party's part in this. The documentary repeatedly emphasizes that the Communist Party was doing this for their own propaganda purposes. So the Communist Party had a narrative that they wanted to sell about racial injustice in the American South, and they wanted to use this as a recruiting tool to recruit Southern blacks into their organization. And so they found this a useful propagandizing tool. And this is emphasized over and over again in the documentary. And I thought maybe it was a little bit unfair to the Communist Party. And maybe I'm showing a little bit of my biases here. I happen to be on the left. So I'm the type of person that would be maybe sympathetic to the Communist Party. Now, I don't agree with the Communist Party as it was constituted in the 1930s in the US because that was a Stalinist party, essentially. Like, they were supporting Stalin in the USSR. And I'm more of a democratic socialist myself. Now, there's a distinction to be made here, I think, between what I call delusional Stalinists and evil Stalinist. An evil Stalinist is somebody who acknowledges that Stalin had the purges and the death camps and all the terrible things that Stalin did, and still supports Stalin And maybe even they support him because they approve of the purges and the death camps and stuff like that. And then there's a delusional Stalinist. A delusional Stalinist is an idealist who somehow deluded themselves into thinking that the death camps weren't real and the purges weren't real. And this was just something that was concocted by the Western governments and by the Western media because they were anti-communist and they were in some sort of a conspiracy. And I think the vast majority of the US intellectuals in the 1930s and the Communist Party in the 1930s were what I would call delusional Stalinists. Which is to say, I don't think they were evil. I think they got themselves deluded. Now, it used to be, once upon a time, people would say, oh, you know, how could those intellectuals be so deluded? How could we have had so many Stalinists in the 1930s in the US and they denied the death camps and they said that these purges never happened, and how could they be so stupid? You know, that used to be a conundrum trying to explain this. I think we are now currently living in a time where it is no longer a mystery to explain that. I mean, because we are now living in a time where everybody is in their own little intellectual bubble and is delusional. I mean, just go on Facebook or Twitter or something like that, right? There are all these groups that have created their own little bubble where they only believe the information that they're predisposed to believe, and they reject every other kind of information as being some mainstream media conspiracy. It happens on the right, it happens on the left, and it happens among people who are not particularly political, but maybe grab onto some sort of issue, like the anti-vaxxers, or what's another example? There are other clusters of people who have grabbed onto this or that issue who aren't even on the political spectrum necessarily. So in light of everything that we've seen in recent years, I think suddenly the Communist Party in the 1930s, even though we do have to acknowledge that they were wrong about Stalin, I think they look more sympathetic now in light of what we know about human nature now and people's just tendency to do this. Sorry, that's a digression. That's a long way of saying that it somewhat bugged me a little bit, the fact that this documentary was just refusing to give any sort of credit to the Communist Party. Probably the Communist Party was using this case to propagandize for a certain extent. And yet, I do think that the Communist Party rank and file, the people who are members of the Communist Party, did really care about racial justice at the time. And you know, I think that's evident if you look at some of the black people who were in the Communist Party at the time. People like Richard Wright, they were attracted to the Communist Party because the Communist Party was the only political party that was actively involved in civil rights work at the time, civil rights issues at the time. So I think these people and these activists should get more credit than the documentary gives them. And I think the documentary could have acknowledged more that, you know, maybe they were using this for propaganda efforts as well, but I think they did legitimately see a huge injustice that was being done, and they were legitimately outraged about the injustice of it. I think they legitimately did care about the racial issues. The other point where this bugs me a little bit is where it comes back again at the end of the documentary, where it talks about the sad lives that the Scottsboro Boys had at the end of it. And they said, you know, all the people who used them for propaganda when they were in the courts, none of them ever cared about them after they got out. You know, none of them looked in to see if they were doing all right. It just talks about how their political sponsors just kind of weren't there for them once they got out of prison and started having all these issues because of the traumatic abuse they'd suffered in prison. And again, I think that's unfair. I mean, granted, it would have been a better world, it would have been a better story if they did get more help. It's a shame that they didn't get more help. But I didn't like the tone of it. I think it's a little bit unfair to blame that on the Communist Party, because the Communist Party is an apparatus that's set up for political agitation and political organization. It was never set up to deal with nine people who were scarred because of their traumatic years in prison. It wasn't set up as a social work organization. And that's especially true because, once these guys got out of prison, I think it was into the 1940s by that time, which means, the Communist Party was past its peak and well into its decline. So, as individuals maybe could support them or give them money, but I think it's unfair to say that the Communist Party abandoned these boys after the trial was over. The Communist Party as a political agitation party just never had the support system in place to deal with the kind of help that these boys needed. And it's unfortunate, but that kind of irked me, where they were trying to imply that the Communist Party just used them for propaganda and then abandoned them. I mean, maybe that is what happened if you want to look at it through that lens, but it's a rather uncharitable lens to look at it through. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure if that particular little bug was worth the time it took me to complain about it, but I had to get that off my chest. Other things to talk about here. There was a review in the Village Voice of this movie when it was first in theaters in 2001. It's no longer on the internet, but it's still accessible through the Internet Archive. And I'll leave a link down below to the Internet Archive version of that article, and you can read it. I thought it was a very intelligent review of this film. They talked about how the filmmakers had rescued this story from the archives, and what I've been talking about before, essentially, done a lot of hard digging through not only the archives in the U.S., but I guess through the communist archives in Russia, because again, this had been like the Communist Party had made this into an international story, to recreate all this footage and all these photographs and stuff like that. They were slightly critical, this Village Voice review, of the somewhat formulaic way in which this documentary had been put together, which they attributed to the fact that because it was funded by PBS and the American Experience, the filmmakers needed to box their story in to this pre-selected format, which is kind of, 90 minutes, you show some clips, you have people talking over the clips, the kind of talking heads type thing. And then there may be some truth to that. The fact that this is, it's almost a shame that this documentary is only 90 minutes instead of 3 hours long, because you do get the sense that a lot is being compressed here. I mean, on the other hand, it's a very tight 90 minutes. I mean, if it had been twice as long, I'm sure it would have been good. But the fact that they crammed everything into those 90 minutes means it's an absolutely fascinating 90 minutes. The other criticism they had of this movie, this documentary, and I think this was fair, is that the voices of the Scottsboro Boys themselves were seldom allowed to come out. So we hear about the trial. We get the whole story of this New York lawyer who comes down to defend the Scottsboro Boys because, the Communist Party is paying him. And we get the whole story of how brilliant he is in his cross-examinations. And don't get me wrong, it's all fascinating as far as it goes. But the review from the Village Voice said, we hardly ever get to hear from the Scottsboro Boys themselves. Just a tail bit at the end. When we get some clips from, some brief excerpts from autobiography that one of them wrote, or memoirs that one of them wrote. And they said this little bit we get indicates that perhaps there was a lot more here. that could have been used earlier in the documentary to flesh these boys out. I mean, where they would have been able to cram that in that 90-minute documentary, I don't know. And again, they were apparently locked into that 90-minute format because this was funded by